session will start in 1 minute. Just before that, so this session is about how to make multilateral economic governance more effective for sustainability. You will be able to ask questions to our distinguished panelists by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be moderated. We will select some of them to have an open discussion at the end of the session. And so it is now my pleasure to give the floor to the chair of the session, Lord Nicholas Stern, who I think you all know, but who is a professor of economics and government, chairman of the Grantham Research Institute, and head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. So, Lord Stern, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lena. I should emphasize I usually go under the name of Nick, so you could address me that way. That would be very good. This is in celebration of the 20th anniversary of IDRI. I've had the great pleasure and privilege to be associated with IDRI from the very early days. So I wanted to start with congratulations for the last 20 years and the expression of hope and encouragement, anticipation, I think for the next 10 years, because I'm going to emphasize the next 10 years as decisive in our future. The panel is extraordinarily distinguished. I will introduce each one as I come to ask the first question. And the first question will be really the subject of the seminar, the conference itself, or this part of the conference, making multilateral economic governance more effective for sustainable development. It's a purposive question, more effective for sustainable development, and let's emphasize effectiveness for that purpose in our discussion. So let me start with my own thoughts on that, and I'm going to rest my argument on the observation, which probably would be shared, at least I hope so, that the next 10 years are decisive for the future of our planet, for the SD Sustainable Development Goals, whether we manage climate and biodiversity effectively, whether we drive development forward in a way that can be sustained, or whether we go into still deeper danger. Two ways of emphasizing the urgency. We have to cut emissions globally, totally, by at least 40% this decade to keep us even roughly on track for the 1.5 degree target, which I hope that we share, given how much more dangerous 2 degrees is. We have to cut global emissions by 40%. And of course, we have to go to net zero by mid-century globally. That is alongside the observation that the world's infrastructure will probably double in the next 15 or 20 years. It doesn't matter for this argument whether it doubles in 15 or 22, it will be growing very strongly, roughly doubling in this next couple of decades. If that infrastructure looks anything like the infrastructure that we have already, we're building a new lot, put it side by side with the old. If it looks anything like its predecessor, then say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. So just those two observations. We've got to cut by 40% to keep us on track, keep 1.5 within reach, and we have to build an infrastructure, much of it in the emerging market and developing world, given the stages of development they'll be going through, the urbanization and so on. We have to build that infrastructure very differently. It will be built in the next 15 or 20 years, and that means the decisions in the beginning will be taken in the next few years, almost now. So there's a tremendous urgency there if we are to be effective, to quote the title, effective for sustainable development. So that's the challenge. Will our institutions be able to deliver? Can we make our institutions work so that we can deliver? Because we must deliver. So the problem is many analogies with the rebuilding after the Second World War, which requires investment, finance, internationalist spirit. But we have one advantage, is that many of the institutions that we need to create were indeed created around that time, and of course others since. The downside is that the challenge is so much bigger actually than the challenge of rebuilding after the Second World War. But I think we're all here because we believe it's feasible. So that's the way I would try phrasing the question, as it were, sort of a challenge and opening up perspective on this story. Building institutions takes a long time. I think it took the World Bank 3 years to make its first loan. That's not the kind of time that we have. So my first proposition is we have an immense task. We're in a hurry. Let's make the best use of the institution that we have. What are the tasks? Well, obviously can't go into great detail, but basically we have to increase our investment physically by 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. We have to have a strong focus on natural capital, and we have to invest strongly in our human resources, education, health, and we have to do that in a way that gives everybody a chance. In a process of very fast change and dislocation, our social cohesion, our fairness will matter enormously, as a matter of justice, but also as a matter of success in terms of getting the job done. So that's a measure of the challenge. We really can increase investment. We live in a world where planned savings is bigger than planned investment. The right answer to that is increased planned investment. So it's perfectly possible to do it, but it's tough, it's big, it has to be fast, and there'll be dislocations which we have to manage, and past scars and difficulties, particularly around inequality and health, particularly during the pandemic, but before, that we have to cope with. So that's the challenge that I would put. So how do we do it? Well, we have to identify the kinds of investments that we have to make. And there are many organizations, many of which that we on this panel are involved with, that have been working away on the kinds of investments that are necessary. You know, some of us here on the Global Commission on the Economy and the Climate, many of countries themselves, of course, have looked at the challenge in energy. There's the International Energy Agency, the IFIs, the MDBs, multilateral development banks, have been looking at this kind of investment. These investments will be shaped by countries and the investment climate, the ability to get jobs done, the identification strategy country by country will be important, and the policies that draw that investment through. And then you need the right kind of finance, the right place, the right time. So that will involve domestic resource mobilization, particularly around health and education, which is more difficult to really finance in long term on aid, although aid can help. The private sector is going to be of central importance in investment in most countries. Government investment would range, from 12% to 18% of GDP. The majority of it would be private. Of course, infrastructure, those fractions are a bit different. But essentially, the mobilization of private investment would be extraordinarily important. And for many of the poorer countries in the world, low-cost external international capital, whether it be from bilaterals, from multilaterals, cooperating, one would hope, with development banks, which are internal also to those countries and regions. So that's the kind of job that we have. And I think we can see that the international institutions can help with all of the story of identifying investment, creating policies and institutions that draw investments through, and financing that investment. I do think that the international agencies can work well if they are pressed by their shareholders and they are supported by their shareholders. And that's in large measure the challenge. I think, for example, the leadership we've had at the IMF around climate, infrastructure, gender, and so on under Christine Christine Lagarde and Kristalina Georgieva have been examples of that kind of leadership. I had the privilege of working at the World Bank with Jim Wolferson, who really did push priorities in a strong direction. I had the privilege of being chief economist at the EBRD when Jacques de Rosière was the head, and he made it work. So I think there are examples with the right kind of leadership, the right kind of pressure from the shareholders, and the right kind of support from the shareholders that these can work. And a collaborative spirit across the whole finance story will be very important. Involvement of civil society in a very strong way in managing the transition will be very important. So here's my suggestion. The title is Making Multilateral Economic Governance More Effective for Sustainable Development. We've defined together, many of the people on this call as a whole, we've defined in large measure what we have to do. How can we make our international institutions work to get it done? If we do need new ones, what do they look like and how can they be made to work? So I hope that overall question is okay. Let's now turn to our panel to respond to that broad question. And then bearing in mind that I'll come back to you, each panel member, with the more specific questions focused on one of your key areas of leadership and expertise. So Sharon, can I start with you on that very big question? We work together on many aspects of it. You're welcome. Sharon is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Sharon, please.
Thank you, Nick. And I would say that you're right. We don't have time to actually construct the perfect future in terms of our multilateral institutions. But what we do need is for them to reform themselves rapidly on the question of what makes for a sustainable future. So if the world accepts that we have to have an economy that is, in fact, that has a lens, an ESG lens, so that the environment, the social foundations, and the governance free of corruption is absolutely the future, then that requires people to act accordingly. You know, even this morning on a social piece, I was previewing an article about facial recognition and how it's being used by China and now Amazon against citizens and workers in the worst of surveillance and in the case of China, discrimination. We need to be very clear that our future is one that respects the urgent action we need for the environment, the repair of a failed economic model that has not served people well. And even if you look at the vaccine nationalism as a symbol of everything that's wrong, then why is it that we can make so much wealth, Nick, and yet we're not prepared to share it? We're not prepared to invest it in a planet that will sustain us all. We're not prepared to invest it in indeed the shared prosperity that would bring our new social contract, decent work with rights, jobs, and of course, social protection, equality, and inclusion. So I think the institutions are fine. We need Bretton Woods institutions. We need a WTO. We need a UN. And can I say, I'm delighted with the leadership of the Secretary General of the UN, with their accelerator for jobs and social protection, with their financing for development, with the push for the SDGs, which is the future foundations for the kind of world we want. But we need to do much more, and it needs to be fast, and people need to accept that we can't have business as usual.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Next amongst our very distinguished panel is Carlos Lopez, who's professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Carlos, welcome. Could we have your thoughts, please?
Thank you, Nick. Allow me to speak from an African perspective. Africa is by far the continent closest to the net zero targets. And the reason for that is not due to the immense commodity dependency that we have in the continent, including 40% of our exports going to fossil fuels. It is because of lack of development that we found ourselves in that nice situation. And of course, there is a tension that is going to be increasingly at the center of the discussion, which is, are we in Africa going to be able to actually develop under the conditions that are going to be much more stringent from a climate mitigation perspective? And I think we should not consider that mitigation challenge as something that Africa is not embracing, but something that Africa will have more difficulties than any others to fulfill, because of the situation that we have, socially speaking, but also the demographic transition that the continent is undergoing. So how do we address that tension is extremely important, because it requires a global solution. And part of that global solution is going to be not using climate the same way as in the past. Industrialization and other types of very important growth opportunities for other regions basically kicked the ladder when they were at a certain stage. We cannot do that with climate. We have to find a way of financing the transition in Africa properly. A lot of promises have been made, but they are not fulfilled. So we are really with a huge gap. Vaccine nationalism is just one demonstration of the same type of behavior. So we'll need to move into the direction of expressing global public goods in a different way. What we are seeing right now is that we have global public goods discussion being absorbed by a certain mentality of the past, where it's basically global public goods in terms of narratives, in terms of proclamations, in terms of intentions, even in terms of policies that are proclaimed, but in fact not implemented with the solidarity dimension that should be at the center of the concept. And I think that's the challenge that we have to face in the future.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Our next panelist is Mahmoud Moldeen. And Mahmoud, thank you very much for your early start, because you're in Washington, DC, where you are the executive director of the IMF. And can I personally, I hope I'm not abusing my position here, thank you and the board for the very wise decision that you took to express your full confidence in the splendid Kristalina Georgieva. You don't have to reply to that, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to express my own strong feeling on this. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for being here. And could you offer us, share your observations on our basic question, please?
Right. Thank you so much, Nick. It's an honor for me to join you and the rest of colleagues and friends on this important panel. And let me as well recognize your very important article that you shared in the midst of the issue of the Doing Business saga, that was very much enlightening to many of us about what it should be done, doing the right thing. And it was basically taking the right decision at the end. I subscribe to everything our statement had shared on that issue, and I will not elaborate more on this. But it could be coming in the context of the challenges facing the multilateral system. That I'll put it in a context. It's beyond doing business. So I think you set up very nicely at the beginning about the challenges and the opportunities and the issues that we are facing today towards 2030. It should be a marathon towards achieving the SDGs, the climate targets. And we are doing that while we're still in the middle of the health crisis. We are suffering for the first time with great symptoms of great divergence after decades of convergence. And every element related to trade, to investment, and to knowledge transfer is not really helping us to achieve the required convergence between the developing economies and the advanced economies. And what was shared yesterday by the IMF in terms of the projections of growth for this year and next year are not really telling us that what's happening is transitory or temporary when it comes to growth. It seems that the elements of recovery for many of the low-income countries and developing economies need a lot of help and support. And the convergence happened during the last decades was basically because trade channels were open, investment channels were open, and equally, if not more importantly, the knowledge transfer channels were open. Now we are seeing variety of restrictions against all of these channels of cooperation. The only channel that remained resilient is the remittances of workers abroad. This is the only thing that didn't really suffer much as compared to trade and investment. So while we are about to have these kind of huge investments, you mentioned with emphasis, one of them, Nick and colleagues as well, on issues related to infrastructure, investments in human capital, investment and resilience require massive finance. I admire the work of many people trying to push into that area, including Remy's work with his network on the National Development Banks network. We need more beyond transactions from the private sector. So that gets me into the second point. How can you do that through great diversion? This is the main challenge. But the definition of sustainability that some of us use, and I admire your leadership on this area, Nick, but I'm coming from developing country and Cairo and saying greetings to Cape Town. We were talking about connectivity in Africa with that road coming from Cairo to Cape Town that was like 100 years old kind of a project. It's about the lack of infrastructure connecting us for better value added, for creating jobs. It's not trade for trade, it's not trade for investment, but for inclusive growth and jobs. So what we are doing better now on the infrastructure side to connect us all. My concern with issues related to sustainability is the following. While I admire the work on climate change, but as you rightly mentioned, climate change is one, but biodiversity is another challenge. And the overall sustainable development goal that we are facing is another one. So to reduce sustainability to only become climate change and the rest of us need to live on the co-benefits of investments may not really be the right thing. It's basically the framework that you mentioned. It's basically at the end of the day, climate change is SDG 13. We need to put it within that global framework, and we need to push hard in these directions. My final point is basically about the adequacy of the multilateral system that we inherited from the founding fathers of the multilateral system that we are benefiting from its existence. I share, of course, Sharon's view on what the SG is doing in at the UN, his initiative in the finance for development, on other areas of work, including jobs, social protection, his proposal for our common agenda with emphasis on people, the social contract, and the inclusiveness is all great. At the same time, we see that many of the institutions that we inherited from the 1940s were not really dynamic enough in their evolution. They are not inclusive enough to accommodate the aspirations of the rising power. The engagement with trade unions, with the private sector, with the employers is not really sufficient enough. And the very worrying part is basically that these institutions are not flexible enough to accommodate the rising power share in the global economy. So we might be facing one of two troubles, being in an academic environment, either a kind of a Thucydides kind of a challenge that the incumbent power is not giving way to the rising power, or a kind of a Kindleberger moment that it's the same thing, that we're not passing the baton nicely from the incumbents to the rising. This is a very complicated matter, and I think some of the things, that's why I'm saying the doing business saga is not just about the report, it's basically about this kind of unhealthy tension that could be really with great impact to paralyze our multilateral system, the tension between US-China, the tension between the emerging markets and some of the advanced economies, more restrictions, not just in trade and investment, but again, within the multilateral system, we're not really going to be helpful to that big, ambitious goal and target that you put for us, dear Nick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. And I think the fact that a number of us who have lapels are wearing on our lapel the badge of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think indicates a shared definition in operational terms, as well as conceptual terms, of what sustainable development means. And I trust that that's broadly our definition for the purpose of this discussion. So thank you very much, Mahmoud. And now to pass over to Yukari Takamura, who is a professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. And as for everybody, my apologies for any mispronunciation of names. Yukari, please.
Thank you. You correctly pronounced my name. Thank you very much, Nicholas. So thank you very much for especially the Idri, for the inviting me such a wonderful panel, especially with the eminent chair and the panelist. So of course, I'm not a representative of the multinational institution or the international organization. So I try to reply to the question by chair from the Asian perspective. As you know, that Asia is a driver of the global economic development, and also at the same time contributed maybe the most to the environmental problems such as the climate change. As you know, the region's emissions actually accounts for the more than 50% of the global emission, global greenhouse gas emission. And at the same time, the region is quite vulnerable in air pollution or environmental problems such as plastic issues and climate change, as of course. Looking at the regional economic governance, I think I have to say that the region's economic governance is quite weak because of due to diversity of country in terms of the economic development and also political system. And of course, we see, for instance, ASEAN, which is an organization of the economic integration, and which actually has started to enhance the cooperation in environmental field and even human rights field, but quite a soft way and gradual way. So due to the quite a large diversity of the region, the economic governance of Asia is a kind of patchwork type. So as you might know, that East Asia is for the political and historical reason is far from the regional, say, integration. So from that perspective, I think of course the regional economic governance of Asia is important, but we need some push from the multinational economic governance and institutions. So maybe I could say that especially two areas that I wish to see the progress of the integration of the more environmental integration into multinational economic governance. One is we see now even in Asian countries that there's quite a big behavior change of corporate and company, especially pushed by climate risk disclosure, and also there's some kind of constructive discussion and engagement by private financial institutions. One of the topic maybe in the form of the question, how we can anchor this good move on the part of private company and financial institution in the multinational economic governance more or to enhance them. The second maybe topic and area that I wish to see some kind of progress in the multinational economic governance is that I know that the European Union has just proposed the Fit for 55. Among them, there is a proposal of the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That actually raised a big discussion even in Japan, in Asian countries, But I think that actually raise our awareness that how we integrate price on carbon more effectively into our economic governance. So that's the issue that I wish really to hear from the representative of the multinational economic institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yukari. And now over to Rémi Rioux, who is the head of the Agence France de Développement, but also of the IDFC, which is a union, a gathering of development finance institutions beyond the familiar MDBs, and of course with very substantial firepower. So Rémi, you're very welcome. Could we have your thoughts, please?
Thank you, Nick, and good morning to all of you. Lots of friends in the room. Pleasure to see you again. Happy birthday, Idri. 20 years. It's a privilege to be so young. AFD will soon turn 80. As you know, we are the oldest, 3 years before Bretton Woods, and trying to be as fresh as possible. To answer you, and Nick, of course, and Mahmoud, as you know, we're all preparing for COP26, where we're all rallying behind you to make it a success for climate. Personal views to answer your question, Nick. I was there, like many of you, in Addis, in New York, in Paris back in 2015. So I lived this epiphany, I would say, of multilateralism. I value, I serve, I commend multilateralism. But something happened and something is deploying since 2015 that is still actually very unclear and very interesting. As you know, the world of SDGs, a lot of it is happening in the world of SDGs, maybe more than on the strategic issues right now, but we don't know exactly what is the end of the journey all institutions are engaged in. And probably we have not fully pivoted yet towards SDGs, many of us. And this agenda so broad that goes beyond the sectoral priorities, that is rediscovering geography, like Carlos was saying, in their specifics, and also an agenda that is striking a different balance, I would say, between international and national duties. So we're still exploring and dealing with this message that is still very much alive and active. My view is that now we need to have more clarity on the architecture. Certainly, there's a governance issue. We have, yes, very strong leaders. Antonio Guterres, Kristalina Georgieva are certainly leading in their respective capacities. But the governance of SDGs as a whole is not completely there yet. A lot of discussion right now on health in a G20 that are absolutely fascinating. A lot of discussion also on how could we reach a common language between public and private. I mean, ESG and SDGs. At the time, we need to merge and converge in the way we are talking about the challenges. We need incentives, stronger incentives that are still lacking. Our mandates for all of us needs to be strengthened. We need to spur cooperation through financial innovation. For instance, I can come back to it later, but the question of mobilization of the private sector and private finance is still very unclear, and incentives are not there yet from our shareholders. And we need a stronger firepower. So and SDR is certainly a unique opportunity to strengthen, I would say, multilateralism, but multilateralism in its capacity to mobilize and reach deep in national and subnational constituencies. And probably, and I stop here, I see really a global architecture with this SDG governance. I think we need 4 specific thematic global funds. Good news, we have already 3 of them. We have a fund for climate, it's a Green Climate Fund. We have a fund for nature, it's the GEF. We have a fund for education, it's the Global Partnership on Education. And we're close to have a global fund for health. And if so, of course, with the World Bank closing the gaps, you could position what we are progressively building. This is this finance in common movement. I will explain at a later stage. We could organize a vast pyramid of implementing institutions, financial institutions, of course, incentivized by this governance and these global funds in an open architecture that could help align trajectories, align operations, and in the end, align the monde itself, leaving no one behind, especially African colleagues. I'm coming back from Montpellier with President Macron, so we received a shot of ambition and respect and cooperation that we intend to implement very ambitiously. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rémi. And our next panelist for our broad question is Jean-Marie Pogan, who is the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Jean-Marie, welcome. Please give us your response.
Well, thank you, Professor, and good morning, everyone. If I try to answer a question which is about making our institution work for sustainable development, I think that we are coming to it, maybe slowly or lately, but we are coming to it definitely in the WTO. You may refer everyone to the communique from yesterday from the G20 trade minister, which I think marks an unprecedented recognition of the sustainable development goals in the context of the WTO and trade policy. And you also may remember that we have a specific SDG which has been assigned to us, which is SDG 14.6, which is about reforming subsidies to the fisheries, subsidies contributing to illegal fisheries and unreported fisheries or overfishing. But more broadly, I think that we are witnessing some what I call the shift of paradigm in the relation between trade and the environment, which takes the form of 4 changes. The first one is a perception of the economic reality itself. Environment has always been presented as a cost, an obstacle to growth or to the growth of trade. Now we see that it's the opposite. The environment becomes seen as an opportunity, and it's to the contrary, the unsustainable trade or economic development which becomes a threat to growth, as the recent forecast from the IMF that I think Mahmoud was alluding to yesterday clearly state. So that's the first change. Second change, it's about how to deal with the externalities from trade. And traditionally, in Bretton Woods setting of the GATT, environment was absolutely recognized as a legitimate objective, even superior to trade, but to be dealt outside of the world trading system as an exception. Now it is changing. Our negotiators are starting to see trade as part of the solution. So from an exception to solution, there is a second change happening. there. The third change, probably one of the most difficult, is about the mindset or the negotiating method. We grew up in a trading system built on the give and take kind of culture, a mercantilist approach of exchanging trade concession. It's absolutely different when you have to, when the goal is not to exchange trade concession, but to produce a global public good, as we have to do in fisheries, for instance. Then it's more a model inspired from the Paris Agreement, which should inspire our own negotiation, and we are not fully yet there, I think, in the WTO. And the last change is about the North-South divide. For a long time, the environment has been seen as a rich man concern and potentially a protectionist argument. I think it's not true anymore. What we see more and more in the WTO is a mobilization of trade policy by developing countries themselves on environment-related issue. So, of course, there is still some concern about protectionism, and the CBAM debate, which has been alluded to by Yukari, I think is one of them. And I'll be happy to develop or to elaborate on this later on, but it's no longer a purely North-South divide. So at the end of the day, we have an environmental agenda which was frozen after the launch of our Doha round. The Doha Declaration integrated a very ambitious environmental agenda, which was completely forgotten in 2003. And some of it is coming back now under a plurilateral setting, because we have a lot of difficulties in the WTO to reach multilateral consensus on any issue, not on environment especially, but it's coming through different initiatives at the plurilateral level. I stop here because that was just the first shot, but happy to elaborate and come back on several details.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. And our last panelist, Karim Salouan, who is the Director of Resilience and Director of Alter. And please, Karim, please go ahead. And I can see you're sharing your screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank IDRI for allowing us to bring this challenge of sustainable finance to the table. Concerning me, I will address the urgency of sustainable finance to accelerate the adaptation to climate change while respecting the Paris Agreements and the SDGs. First of all, I don't know if you could see my screen, the full screen, yes. First of all, the cities infrastructure are not adapted. This is the first issue, the first challenge, how we could finance this damage. How? Without strong infrastructure, it's impossible to secure a sustainable development. Some inconvenient truth, for example, here you could see three values, and for example, the cost of the flooding in the coastal cities, it could be estimated by the World Bank around 750 billion euro per year. The second point here, the 700 billion euros per year. This is the investment by corporation to adapt their business model and their assets. And the cost for the insurance sector from 2018 to 2020 multiplied by 4. Well, the second point is the cost of inaction. If we don't target or achieve the Paris Agreement, the climate change could impact 15 and 30% of the global GDP. It's very important. Without this conscience, it's impossible to secure the sustainable development. The second point here, this is we need the climate change resilience. We need the strong infrastructure. For example, the cities and infrastructure are facing shocks and stress due to climate change. The adaptation will cause very more and more expensive. And of course, we shift in Earth climate brings potentially between the profound implications for insurance, financial stability, and the economy. The question could be, how much would it costs the private and public stakeholder if you want to call resilience and without waste money, for example, because we need to find solution with finance, for example, to reduce the cost of dysfunction, to reduce the cost of emergency adaptation, the cost of insurance risk, the financial risk, and losing first mover position of competitive advantage for cities or territories, for example. Here, we could, for example, reimagine the necessity to match the resilience infrastructure with the sustainable goals and the climate adaptation investment. But so to achieve this idea, this objective, we need to implement several types of climate change scenarios. We need to develop a strong knowledge concerning the climate change scenarios. Without this knowledge, impossible also to design the best business model or the best financial evaluation. That's why, for example, we could innovate the financial engineering in the PPP, integrating the climate change adaptation in all life cycle of the project, from the project identification, the project preparation phase, the procurement phase, and the implementation contract for the management phase, for example. During the design, build, and operation of all infrastructure, it's very important to integrate during all the PPP, the climate change for all these phases. To conclude, we will incorporate climate change adaptation and mitigation issue to investments, analysis, and for the decision-making process for 6 reasons from me. For example, this is an advocacy here, address climate change adaptation and mitigation issues in investments, support development of climate change adaptation and mitigation, related tool, metrics, and analysis. Also assess the capabilities of internal and external investment manager to incorporate the several climate issues. Ask also investment services provider to integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation factors into evolving research and analysis, encourage academic and other research on this term, or all the stakeholder, insurance, rating agency, the international funder, cities, etc., etc., and also advocate climate change adaptation and mitigation training for investment professionals. To conclude, I think that this is my position, but we could discuss if you want. It has now become an urgency to increase funding in the context of Earth and climate change scenarios. And it's the only way forward if we were to pursue the true global sustainable development and in the world. This is illusory for me to discuss the austerity plan or impose cuts of public spending when facing the need to invest in climate change adaptation. This is my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Karim. And that is the first round with our panelists. And I think we had some fairly clear messages from that. I think a shared understanding of the objectives of sustainable development, summarized in large measure in the Sustainable Development Goals, together with a sense of urgency. Secondly, we had strong emphasis on the way in which the world has changed since most of the international institutions were created, including, of course, we now have a much more multipolar world than we did before. And then most of us, I think, would celebrate that. Secondly, we have some very intense problems, particularly around the environment in its very broad sense, but also in terms of pandemics, in terms of inequality across the world. We have some new or intensified problems relative to where we were at the end of the Second World War, when many of these institutions were founded. Within that story, the private sector around the world has become still more important. So it's a different world in the sense of its economic and social structure, and it's a different world in the sense of the pressures that it faces, or at least our understanding of the pressures that it faces. And of course, it's a different world in terms of technologies as well. So given the objectives, given the way the world and the challenges have changed, we have been trying to ask how our international institutions should be reformed, developed, taken forward, so that they better fit the purpose in relation to the new world and the new challenges. And thirdly, we had a very strong emphasis on behavior and rights and solidarity within that framework. And so how you behave within whatever institutional structure you have, how you see your joint responsibilities, your solidarity, your multilateralism, your respect for rights and so on, is extremely important as well. So we have to ask ourselves, how can that kind of behavior and international spirit be developed within any institutional structure that you operate in? Now, it was a much richer discussion than that very brief summary indicates, but I think there are some very strong themes running through what we have been grappling with. So now is our second round. We should try to finish this second round of questions in about 20 minutes. So we've been not bad so far. If we could stay within the 3 minutes this time round, then we should have good chance for discussion with all those who have joined us today. So these are questions which are a bit more specific to some of the areas where you lead. Now, I know many of you lead in more than one area, but this is a question that's specific to one of those areas in which you lead. So let me go in the same order, please. So Sharon, the question is, what new social contract needs to be forged to make sure that the transition towards a net zero economy allows social progress in terms of livelihoods, fairness and justice, and planetary protection for all? Sharon, please.
So a just recovery and building resilience requires a new social contract, but that social contract needs to have people and planet at the center of our economic model. Otherwise, we will find ourselves in the same situation we are today, a fractured future with little or no hope of reaching the urgent ambition on climate or returning to full employment and creating the 575 million jobs we need by 2030 to realise Goal 8, or formalising the informal economy, which is indeed creating despair with a broken labour market. But for workers, the new social contract's easy, Nick. It's jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs. They have to be climate-friendly with just transition. It is about decent work. It's about universal human and labour rights. But I would argue that mandated due diligence has to be equally about environmental standards. And corporations have to change the way they think about not just an analysis of risk, but indeed grievance and remedy. It is about universal social protection. We've shown that investment in universal social protection, the foundations of resilience, can return up to 1.9% to economies. That's jobs, it's a basic economy, but more than anything, it's the health and education and income that people need to weather shocks. And if we don't actually look to inclusion of not just income, but of equality, not just income, but gender and race, we'll never indeed achieve that inclusive society that the SDGs promise.
Thank you, Sharon. And next, Carlos, please. I'm going to read the question, which I know you have, but to which the audience doesn't have. What structural economic transformation is required for the African continent? How to enshrine the common but differentiated responsibilities principle and establish adequate instruments for partnership between the African continent and its partners? Carlos, please.
Well, it is clear that Africa is the latecomer when it comes to structural transformation. That has in itself a lot of challenges to overcome, but also some opportunities. And we should focus on the opportunities. And the opportunities is what I think most of the leadership in Africa is looking for. That's why Africa has been quite forthcoming in terms of adopting the Paris Agreement. And the national determined contributions from Africa are amongst the most ambitious. And that basically translates into wanting to have an industrialization process that is based on green, on low carbon, and a possibility of using leapfrogging technologies to overcome some of the difficulties that others are facing. But this should not come at the expense of us also benefiting from the special conditions relating to our own climate justice imperatives. Because of being the least polluter and emitter, Africa should be compensated for that. And it should come in the form of a more viable global governance system. It should not be free. It should not be based on aid. In my view, it should be based on a more just arrangement in terms of economic governance. And I think that is possible. For instance, the SDRs, the way they are going to be used, will offer an opportunity to see whether we can face some of the difficulties that have been created by lack of access to finance by Africa. And I think we have also an opportunity to demonstrate with the SDRs that we are not going to introduce new forms of conditionality that are going to basically reduce the policy space that Africans already have, which is quite limited. For instance, they have not been able to use monetary policy during this period of pandemic for reasons that we know. So I think one of the preoccupations we should also look into, and this is a question also indirectly to Jean-Marie, is the possibilities of introducing new forms of protectionism that are a bit more sophisticated. Because, you know, the carbon tax, the way we deal with the carbon tax is going to create opportunities or not for Africa. There is a way of dealing with them that actually creates incredible opportunities. But there is also possibility that they are going to be used to constrain Africa's possibility of entering in a more accelerated trade transactions with the rest of the world. So I think these are some of the conditions that we have to bear in mind as we discuss structural transformation in the continent.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And it's a very natural flow to Mahmoud, because as we know, the IMF has been discussing the use of the SDRs, and particularly a resilience and sustainability trust. And I have to say, Carlos, personally, I share your concern that that resilience and sustainability trust should not suffer from the, as it were, slightly backward-looking conditionalities that we've had in the past. So that was a modest abuse of the chair to offer my own opinion. But Mahmoud, please, the question that we've been given for you is, I hope it's all right, how to make trade and growth also work for social inclusion and environmental sustainability. Mahmoud.
Right, thank you so much. And with your permission, Chair, I'd just like to elaborate on what you just mentioned on the SDRs before I get into the trade and growth question, because what Carlos Lopez just mentioned now and your comment on the RST, or the Resilience Sustainability Trust Fund, is very important and very timely, because in the coming weeks we are finalizing the main pillars of the establishment of this new trust fund within the IMF, to complement the work of the PRGT, which is the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust Fund dedicated to low-income countries. So that new fund is going to be with more access opportunities for middle-income countries, which were not served by the old one. But it has the elements of recovery in them, smart and green, as the buzzword these days. So there shouldn't be concern, an issue of concern for them to be used as condition, but basically as guidelines. We are trying, representing developing economies on the board, to make sure that that this is the case. But of course, some wise commentary from outside the fund could enhance as well our way of bargaining within the board. Which is legitimate. I see it that way. On the question, very quickly on trade and growth, I'd like always to put trade these days within the framework, on the finance for development framework that was there in Addis. As you know, trade was one of the main chapters and pillars of the Addis agenda. So you link trade activities to the rest of the SDGs, including, of course, SDG 8, which was just mentioned by Sharon. But what kind of infrastructure that is required beyond, of course, the logistics? There are lots of issues of big concerns, and we cannot blame it on COVID and the disruption that happened in the supply chain. The tension in the trading system, the issues of big concern, the new protectionist measures that Carlos mentioned have been very much there before COVID, and now we are seeing new forms of them. I think it was Professor Jeffrey Frankel who said, with simple calculation, that we are still at the same level of trade to GDP as we were back in 2008, 2009, as far as developing economies are concerned. This is very worrying. And again, we spoke earlier about issues of convergence, and I agree that matters related to divergence are not limited to the old debate between North and South, because even within regions and within the Africa region, within the emerging markets at large, you see this kind of divergence. So what we can really be doing, again, I think I'm happy with the new approach with the leadership of the WTO is doing now to make the multilateral system more efficient and more inclusive. We are noticing as well the hurdles facing that, especially in some important elements, and we spoke earlier before the discussion now about the TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights, and how they are impacting essential issues like medicine and the vaccine. But I think matters related to enabling the trading system of developing economies, linking them better to the SDGs, making them more compatible with what we just spoke about now on climate, will make that better done. I have just a final point, because Remy's presence reminds me of an important thing that could really be helpful in the future. Next year, after Glasgow, and we hope and wish all success to Glasgow, the world is moving south. COP27 is going to be hosted in Egypt. Marrakesh is going to be hosting the annual meetings of the fund and the bank in 2022. Indonesia is going to be hosting the G20. So I hope that the move toward the south is not going just to be a move towards nice places to host the meetings, but basically to have this kind of firmness of the approach, and the voice of the south to be heard better. It could be a good opportunity on that front, not just on trade. Trade cannot happen without openness on investment and knowledge transfer.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. And now, Yukari Takamura, here is the question. You know it, but I'll read it for the audience. What are the challenges for the Asia-Pacific region for the transition towards climate neutrality? How to account for the complicated issues of regional integration and cooperation with giants like India and China? And what is the potential for strategic collaboration? Yukari, please.
I think that's a really good and very much complicated question at that time that was posed. But to start with, as the Jean-Marie mentioned, that in Asia as well, and the paradigm shift is happening. As I mentioned, that at a company level and the financial institution level is, of course, but also the country in Asian countries such as China, as you know, the net zero by at the latest by 2060, and the same for the Malaysia, and also the Indonesia and Thailand. They are already started to talk about how to achieve the net zero by 2050 or the earlier, by around the 2050. So especially I really impressed by the private sector initiative, as I think some of the panelists already mentioned. They are also committed themselves to move toward net zero. I'm talking about in Japan as well, but in Asian countries. And a very important point that the increasing number of the company and now commit themselves to reduce emission of the scope 3, that is the emission from the overall supply chain and value chain. As you know, that the supply chain and value chain of the company in Asia is quite interlinked across borders. So that has quite a significant impact of the environmental improvement. But also the supply chain management is not stopped at the environmental problem. And now the company they look at exercise due diligence of the supply chain value chain across about the human rights or the right of labor. So I think that the regional integration cooperation, how to enhance it in Asian region is quite important, of course. But for the short-term perspective, I think the ADB, Asian Development Bank, is has quite a key role in my view. For example, the Asian Development Bank, Asian Development Bank (ADB) announced that the plan to create a fund with a partnership with the private sector and the government to accelerate early closure of coal-fired plants in Southeast Asia. The new fund actually buys such plants and take an active role in the early retirement and management. So I think such kind of initiative necessary because in Asian country is composed of the emerging and mostly emerging and developing country. Just setting norm and setting standards is not sufficient. We need a concrete and specific assistance for transition. The second point that I expect to the ADB and regional cooperation is that how to ensure that no one should be marginalized with such changes, especially the many vulnerable small and the medium company exist in Asian country. So they might lack the information or the capacity to cope with such moves. So that I expect that the ADB and the other countries, now the paradigm is actually changing, that we could collaborate and cooperate to enhance the environmental, improvement and also strengthen the capacity building of these vulnerable sectors. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Yukari. And now, Amy, how to efficiently and effectively orient investments towards the SDGs? What are the necessary alliances between actors to increase ambitions for financing social and environmental sustainability? Amy, please.
Yes. I think, Nick, we're all realizing, yes, the magnitude of the challenge to finance SDGs. Progressively, this is, the reality of the pandemic, the environment, the inequalities you were referring to. This is also what our leaders said in 2015. Again, this is Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, meaning finance is not a means to an end, but an end in itself, and the 20 trillion US dollar of investments each year have to be purified. I mean, have to be greened, have to be bettered, and we're not there yet by far. All the segments of the financial system probably have to move out of their comfort zone and cooperate way more actively. Yes, the question starts with development aid. I think there's a lot to share in the world of from the world of development finance that was somehow on the sidelines for too long, but where we know how to maximize concessional resources for sustainable investments, where we have accumulated a lot of experience on climate, on social issues, of course, and many of us are engaged in this in this journey, we already spilled over from development finance to climate finance, of course, with a different referential, with different types of investments. And now we are close to discuss with the private sector about SDG finance. We are already issuing bonds, for instance. So 50% of the financing of AFD is with green and sustainable bonds already. Why not 100% in a few months or years? But this journey is not yet fully shared and fully rewarded. And so we need to support willing financial institutions. So this is part of the discussion about the on-lending and the allocation of SDR. So of course we have the PRGT, we have well, if the rules of this RST are not yet finalized, why not envisage some sort of access for institutions or investments? And if not through the IMF, you know that President Adesina from the African Development Bank proposed, since the African Development Bank is eligible, a prescribed holder of SDR, well, to receive a part of these resources, to leverage them and to leverage then second round national development banks, local institutions deep in the African fabric to help industrialize, to build the local capacities, local production for vaccines and other goods and services in Africa, as Carlos was saying. So we need more resources. We need absolutely a common methodology, common taxonomy, public and private. So this is what TCFD for climate, what TNFD for nature is working on. There are already 200 tools around, so we need to streamline that drastically in order to mobilize, of course, public financial institutions and private financial institutions all together. This is the purpose of the Finance in Common movement we launched November 2020. I don't know if there's a third round of questions because I don't want to exhaust it, but just have in mind that we will gather again next week, 19th and 20th in Rome, at the invitation of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, a very large national development bank engaged in the transformation of Italy, with IFAD, of course, because food security and agroecology is so important right now, and to help this global financial architecture structure over time, embarking as many partners for SDGs.
Thank you so much, Rémi. The third round of questions will be less structured. There'll be questions from the audience, but we're going all right. So we should be leaving about half an hour for questions from the audience. So that would be the third round, but it will be less structured in the hands of the audience itself. So now, Jean-Marie Pogon, how can trade make a positive contribution to the achievement of the environmental public goods pursued by international society? How have environmental issues been better included in the WTO institutional framework and WTO law? It has a past tense, but I hope there's a future tense there as well. Over to you, Jean-Marie.
Well, thank you, Nicolas. I think in general, we start having quite a good vision of what can be done through trade and trade policy. And there are two things, essentially. We can mobilize first market instruments that can incentivize trade and the private sector into contributing to the production of environmental goods. These instruments are such as tariffs and non-tariff measures, which can lower the cost of dissemination of pro-environmental technologies. It can be enlarging market access for environmental services so that the economies of scale can play their role in fighting the climate change, for instance. It's very much about subsidies, reforming harmful subsidies. There is a question from the audience on that point from Mr. Storm. I think this is very much something that is in the realm of trade policy, and also working on standards and regulation in trade to make sure that they are grounded on best practices, sound science, and non-protectionism. So this is the kind of thing that we can do. At the WTO level, there is some element of subsidiarity. We know that we are good when there is an element of free riding in the game, and this is where the WTO can play its more efficient role. I think fisheries subsidies that I previously mentioned are a good example because, you know, the fish does not know frontiers. So if you reduce subsidies somewhere, it can go elsewhere. Same thing with fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is being proposed by some of our members, such as New Zealand. This is also a global issue where the WTO can have a role. Concerning the question of Carlos on the just transition toward decarbonation and the possibility to achieve some border tax adjustment in a non-protectionist manner, I think that from a global architecture standpoint, it's perfectly possible in the WTO system. And to a large extent, in all fairness, I think that the proposition that the Commission has been tabling is based on non-discrimination at this stage. We know that the Commission proposal may not be the end game after the Parliament and the Council have achieved, but the structure which is being proposed is really designed to be compatible with the WTO. Now, the question is that the devil is always in the details, and the details, there are two kinds. The first kind is going to be, how do you calculate the amount of carbon incorporated in your products? And this can be extremely complicated to do in practice. And the second element is, how do you take into account, I think this is what you had in mind, Carlos, how do you take into account the efforts which are made by third countries to fight climate change? So there is a need for equivalence here, taking into account the effort of the other. If I have a permit emission trading, for instance, and you have a carbon tax, there is some sort of equivalence to find. The good news is that the European proposition plans for a 3 years blank shot, which is about applying the CBAM without leveraging the money, which is imposing the cost. So I think it's a good signal that there is room for discussion to try to track the devils in the details. One word about the trade tensions, which has been mentioned. I think that one of the unsung song of the multilateral trading system during the COVID is that all the trade, what we are reporting is that the trade measures that we monitor have globally kept under control. And after the beginning of the pandemic, where there was a lot of export restrictions, especially on sanitary goods, the G20 started calling about transparency and moderation in that. And it has, by and large, quite worked well. We saw that the liberalizing or facilitating trade measures have taken over the restrictive measures overall up to that point. So I'm not saying that this is an ideal world, but really the protectionist tension, which could have aggravated the recession, have really more or less kept under control. One of the best proof is that while world trade was collapsing 8%, the trade in sanitary products was rising from approximately 16% last year. So the system worked better than maybe sometimes it's being identified as. Well, over to you, back to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. And our last in this second round is Karim Salouan. What are the requirements for financing sustainable infrastructure for secure and resilient societies? How can infrastructural investments be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So Karim, you began that discussion in your earlier intervention, so there's the opportunity to sort of deepen and broaden. So over to you, Karim.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I repeat, we are living in the period of uncertainty. It's a big challenge because we don't know which type of scenarios we will be facing tomorrow or after tomorrow. In the other world, for example, your finance, if you choose today, could be damaged tomorrow. Because we are living in the multi-risk, not only climate change, COVID, the other global risks, for example. This is essential to review our economy doctrines. Should we, for example, consider investment for adaptation as a cost or as investment with positive externalities? This is, I think, the first question that I want to take on the table. And as the effects, for example, of the austerity continues to ravage cities and the impact of the climate change become more pronounced. Not only in the southern country, also in the western country. You had the feedback in the last summer in Germany, for example. The municipal officials around the world are strongly to pay the climate adaptation. Some cities have already begun to anticipate the new infrastructure that climate change will require, while others have been forced to adapt in real time as climate crises have arrived in spectacular ways. For example, we could, for example, introduce two examples of the most emblematic events are the superstorm Sandy, which damaged New York City in October 12, and the drought-induced crisis of water scarce cities in Cape Town in South Africa, which was most visible between the last years. In both cases, the cities turned, this is a great feedback, turned the green bond, a form of municipal finance that foreground environmental ambitions. And for example, we observe the track of the form of adaptation project that green borrowing are marketed to fund, drawing from the scholarship, for example, of the financialization of the nature alongside with recent work of racial capitalism or the austerity. And we observe that they find some transformative municipal change, each city largely carrying on with the project that will describe existing inequality in the city. In addition, this reflection of the inequality already present in these two cities, New York and Cape Town, for example, the use of municipal debt of adaptation intensify risk, both financial and environmental, borne primarily by the poor of the working class, people or of color. This is a contrast, this is a feedback. And perhaps the building on the qualitative field work in Cape Town in New York and across the green bond investment chain, we could observe that the risk posed by the climate change in the city cannot be financialized away. Ultimately, we observe also in these two examples, the end of the municipality austerity driven by national and the supranational budgeting choices in favor of increasing national funding of municipal adaptation by rescaling borrowing of the to higher political scale that can more progressively distribute risk. In other words, we could say that perhaps we could imagine a new hybrid financial tools combining the adaptation bond and the green bond to support, for example, the investments or to rebuild the infrastructure, but not only the infrastructure, to include all the population, because without the inclusion and without the strong infrastructures, the sustainable development could be achieved.
Thank you very much, Karim. Again, a very productive round. We had the chance to go into more detail on some of the specifics of how all this can work. Again, I think we had a very strong spirit of looking to leadership in the South, the next 3 G20s are Indonesia, India, and Brazil. I'm not going to speculate who the president of Brazil will be in 2024. We live in hope. That I think will be very important examples that Mahmoud gave, also of the leadership of the meeting. I think a strong second theme was around understanding the notion of justice in relation to what happens across economies, what happens within economies, what happens over time. And I follow Amartya Sen on this, that it's easier to understand injustice than justice, and injustice is a right denied, and that means that you have to define what rights are, and we very quickly come back when we discuss justice to notions of rights. And I think that will be and should be an important part of our deliberation over the international institutions. Lots more to say. I think one theme that came through, let me draw it out, was the integration between development, mitigation, and adaptation. Sometimes they're set one against another like a horse race, but so much of what we can do is a wise combination of development, mitigation, and adaptation for resilience. Think about the mangroves. Think about restoring degraded land. Think about public transport in cities. Think about decentralized solar. All of those are development, mitigation, and resilience combined. Not everything fits that way, but a lot of what we need to do does. And the great inspiration, skill, effectiveness subject will be inputting all this together. Much more to say. I think the very interesting strands of different sorts of finance coming through, and how powerful finance is and should be in shaping what happened. But let me not try to summarize anymore, but thank you again for a very thoughtful second round. And now we have just under half an hour for our questions. And the first question will come. Melanie, could you put your screen on, from Menali Vincentes? Hello, Melanie, if I understand well, you're a student at Sciences Po.
Yes.
So you are our future. So what questions do you have about how the young and the not so young can work together to create that better future? Over to you, Melanie.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is for Professor Takamura. And in this session, we've considered the fact that climate change, environment, sustainable development can't be considered as externalities anymore as they were in the Washington Consensus. So you have discussed the role of like giants, like China in an international context. And with reference to your work on climate change in small island states in the Pacific, what are the incentives in place for these giants to cooperate in systems of compensation and or insurance for these smaller states against their emissions? And to what extent do you believe that legally enforced consequences are necessary for cooperation? Do you want me to ask the second question immediately for another panelist, or would you prefer I wait?
If you could give the second question, and then we'll go through in the order you described. Please, Melanie.
Okay, and the second question is for Mr. Mohieldin. It's two-part question, two sides of the same coin. So the first one is in discussing the issue of large-scale multilateral international governments, how can we ensure that actors pay attention to the distributional effects? And the other side of that question is, while Olivier de Schutte argues that the WTO does not prevent procurement programs to be set up, when French municipalities try to buy more local and sustainable food, they face arguments of EU competition law. And even if they win, when they're taken to court, the threat of having competition arguments can deter the design of sustainable food programs. So the question is, could this be an illustration of how international treaties, and especially trade agreements, can prevent the development of sustainable practices? And does our set of international regulations have the potential to create a lock-in effect for an outdated system that prevents the emergence of ecologically sustainable systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Let's ask Yukari and Mahmoud to take those questions in order, but then I'll ask if there are any other comments from others on the panelists. There's a strong element of WTO in the second question. Jean-Marie may wish to come in. But let's go in the order that you suggested, Melanie. Yukari, please.
Thank you, Melanie. So for wonderful question. I think in how to engage, for instance, big giant like China and India, and the discussion of the multinational agenda is quite tough from our experience, even in Asia. But looking at some experience, I think we need some approach, multi-layer approach, if I may. Of course, the interstate negotiation is quite important to setting a multinational standard and to the push the country or government to move forward. But still, on the some issue, we need some different approach. For instance, from the bottom up, maybe engage rather the private sector to do the more active role than the interstate negotiation. So I think that's the reason why that I cited the private sector behavior change in Asia in the previous discussion. And I think maybe this compensation or insurance issue will be addressed by the Carlos again, but still I think that is quite similar. Maybe how to, of course, assist the developing country, which are the most vulnerable. Of course, interstate negotiation, we create a mechanism and the rules, but at the same time, we could more practically, provide assistance to the most vulnerable population in the region. For instance, insurance company already, they started to provide insurance and with a reasonable price and to mitigate the climate impact affect the local population in Asia. So I think maybe it's not a full example, but we need some multi-layer approach to address how to engage and how to change the behavior of big giants. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. I can't resist the quote that the governor of the central bank in South Africa recently made in connection with current discussions at the IMF. I believe it's an old African proverb, Carlos, but Mahmoud, you can guide me. But when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. The next question is from Mahmoud, please. And then I'll ask briefly Jean-Marie to add.
Right, thank you so much. I'm very happy to have Jean-Marie to come and help on the second part of the question. But let me start with that one first, and then I'll go to the role of the international organization, the distribution impact, and issues related to equity and inclusive growth. I think on some of the current trends now that we see, basically about localization of the Sustainable Development Goals at large, not just limited to elements related to sustainable consumption, SDG 12, but overall approach on localization of the SDGs. That requires a completely different system of funding and finance from the one that we started back in Addis, because issues related to local communities, municipalities were basically a kind of an afterthought. When you have exhausted all of the elements related to the central budget and the national arrangement, you say, we'll see what will happen then at the local level, with an assumption that this is going to be cascaded automatically to that level. I think what we have been seeing recently in the engagement of municipalities, local communities, and the role of cities and their mayors is very much different from the assumption that was basically centered around the national effort. That goes into all of the SDGs, but perhaps it has certain implications as well on what kind of a trading system that could really support this more sustainable consumption level, or the sustainability of consumption and production as reflected in SDG 12. On the first question related to all of these kind of arrangements at the international organizations, there is a kind of interesting discussion happening now. We are in the middle of the quota review of the IMF, which is basically shaping the governance structure of the International Monetary Fund. We went through the capital increase of the World Bank, and that was always coming with issues related to voice, because you're not really going to be expecting from these international organizations to factor in the priorities of different countries unless their voice is adequately heard and adequately reflected in the decision-making processes. We're a bit constrained because we're inheriting a system of reviews that is very much, it's a quota-based, and this quota is based on a formula, and the formula is not very much flexible. So what you saw in the last review is not going to be very much different from what you see in the current or the future one. So all of our discussion about this earlier, about how to make the multilateral system, factoring in all of these kind of global changes, the rising power, the right of the South to be participating, is leaving a lot to be desired if the mechanisms of reflecting that in the shareholding and the quota based system is not going to be challenged. Having said that, there have been lots of changes, and I like to quote Kristalina Georgieva, that what the IMF today is not the IMF of your father, is not the IMF in your case, perhaps of your grandfather. Is becoming more inclusive, is becoming actually abandoning the Washington consensus, being more flexible, more pragmatic. Having said that, they could be taking that as in three examples very quickly. I think all of what we said so far will be very much compromised if there is a kind of a debt crisis upon us. So the effort of the IMF and other organizations to prevent a debt crisis from happening, either through debt relief or the issuance of SDRs, this will have definitely a positive impact, but not fully realized because it's more on the prevention side. The other thing, and very quickly, on the emphasis today on how to design government budgets to be more inclusive and to have all of these aspects that we're talking about when it comes to gender, when it comes to the SDGs, reflecting them. The budget of the state is very much important. This is an important document that provides the priorities. And the final thing, and based on that question on the global tax system and the initiatives by the G20, we cannot really do anything related to finance and what Karim just mentioned about funding if there is a major leakage in the system in the form of illicit financial flow, which is not equitable, it's unfair, and it's a crime, really, to steal people's money and to get them into these kind of illicit financial flows. And it has huge distributional impact. So this kind of the role of the international organizations today, trying to factor in these matters. Some of them are in the help and the support that are more realized, and some of them are in the prevention side, which is not adequately realized.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Jean-Marie, could you comment very briefly on the procurement issue, and then we'll try to get a couple more questions in.
Well, yes, Nicholas. Very briefly, the classical approach was that distributional effects were externalities that had to be dealt with by social policy, not by trade policy itself. And the distributional effects are extremely important, as you rightly recall, because this is the nature of comparative advantages to generate intersector reallocation. So what were the answers? The first one was about building the capabilities and the capacity building for countries and people to take advantage of trade. And this has become, since the Doha round, under the form of the Aid for Trade initiative, which is mostly an initiative led by public development agencies, financing agencies, but also the WTO, which is providing aid for trade. The second element of answer comes through the compensation schemes that countries may have domestically. For instance, the Trade Adjustment Act, which exists since the 60s in the US, or social security systems in Europe. And the third element that we see emerging within the WTO has to do with the notion of inclusion, is how to try to mainstream the distributional effect in the design of your trade policy. And there are two entries which are being discussed here. It's still quite new. The first one is gender and trade, which gives way to a lot of discussion, given the impact and the position of women in value chains, which contribute to trade. And the second one is SMEs, which are also big providers of employment and jobs. So this is the type of answer in a nutshell that we are trying to work on.
Very many thanks, Jean-Marie. I would now like to ask Lena to come in with two questions from the audience, and I will turn them to the panelists, starting with those who have not yet participated in this third round. Lena, please.
Yes, with pleasure. So I propose to choose two questions on concrete political pathways, political entry points to cope with two important issues. First question is the following. A lot of the sessions yesterday mentioned that the different regions of the Global South were asking for more resymmetrizing of power in the international economic governance. This has also been mentioned by the panelists in this session. What would be a possible political pathway to do so on the governance architecture? So this is the first one on the rebalance of power with the Global South. And a second one is recommendation from yesterday's sessions are to include much more emphasis on economic and social rights in international economic governance, echoing one proposal by Sharon Burrow. How and where should social rights for workers be better taken into account? Do we have a political entry point for this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. So there are four panelists who have not yet contributed to the third round. Let me start with Sharon. And please, you don't have to reply to both questions. Just prioritize, say what you'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the second one because it's directed at me. But let me say to Melanie, fantastic questions. If all young people are asking these questions, I'm really confident that the world will be in safe hands, Nick, because indeed, if we don't have a fair competition floor for everything we do, then we are not repairing our world. And we are not looking to inclusion. We are not trying to create the conditions for peace and stability and environmental futures on which we can survive and build inclusion on a living planet. And the question around social rights is and economic justice is actually part of that. If you don't take the environment and standards around the environment, and we need tougher standards that are legislated for. The EU is looking at an environmental taxonomy at the moment, just as it is a social taxonomy, but it has to be all inclusive. It can't just be the money we need to do small pieces of the job towards sustainability. It has to be the way we live. And the SDGs are the best guidelines, I would say, Nick, to give us a sense of where we want to go. If you actually think about the SDGs, all of them, and indeed our and the Paris Climate Agreement, these were the path. This was the guidance, the pathway to a net zero, poverty-free world, in which everybody could have the confidence and the hope of a secure future. But unless we're all committed to that, and I fear, going right back to the first question, that too many of our multilateral agencies are in fact not there. They're just not there right now. They have to be, We need these agencies. We possibly need more global architecture, but we certainly need these agencies. But with the WTO ministerial coming up, if they're not prepared to look at rights, you know, human labour rights and environmental rights as a fair competition standard, if they simply keep saying it's somebody else's job, it's UNEP or it's the ILO, that's not going to work, because trade has been based on an exploitative model and on a model that's been destructive to the planet. So it's that simple. It's been exclusionary. I'm a pro-trade person, but we have to have a fair competition floor for sharing the industry policy, the development and the prosperity. And my final point about this is, if we are not serious about the rights base of the SDGs, then we're not going to get the development model right as well. If we want to continue a world where it's dog eat dog, and again, I come back to vaccine nationalism, the big farmers have made their money. In fact, a lot of their product was based on taxpayers' support for development of the vaccines as a public good. That's perfectly fine, but then it has to be shared. And if it's not shared and you're not prepared to share the knowledge and the production capacity, as well as ending the discriminatory TRIPS waiver once you've achieved a basic return. We don't need 9 new billionaires. We need people to be safe everywhere so we can all be safe. And that goes for economic justice, for social justice, and for environmental justice. We really want everybody to pull together on this question.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm going to go Karim, Carlos, and give the last word to Amy. Please try each of the three of you to do it in 2 minutes so that we can close on time. Thank you very much. Over to you, Karim. Karim, you're muted.
Hi, hello. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay, yes. Just thank you very good. Thank you very much, Sharon, because so to complete your recent proposal, I think when we speak about the sustainable development and inclusion, we don't forget, I repeat, we don't forget the vulnerability, the physical vulnerability regarding the climate change impact, for example, because it's impossible to have a sustainable development without the climate risk. We need to mix the both adaptation and mitigation. And so to secure a sustainable development in several countries, the question it could be, how can sustainable infrastructure attract new investment and increase the resilience of projects and assets in face of climate change all around the world? And for example, we could propose the 4 pillars so to achieve this match between the sustainable infrastructure and the needs of the investment, so to become more attractive. It could be, for example, the economical and financial dimension. Consider that the cost benefits of the project and in order to analyze the profitability, productivity, job creation and access to infrastructure services, location, quality, price, etc. The second point could be the environmental aspect. For example, analyzes the aspects such as mitigation and resilience, preservation and restoration of the environment, reduction of pollutants, efficient use of resource, the minimization of the resource, and the proper waste management, for example, the waste management. The social condition, the social link between the infrastructure and the social component. The requirements are given, for example, in relation to impact of on the community, combining poverty, respect for human and labor rights, and the cultural historical preservation. And the final point, it could be the institutional dimension. So to match also the SDGs with the sustainable infrastructure, require, for example, the alignment with the national strategy and the international commitments, adequate governance structures, management and the accountability system, and the development of institutional capacity, plus a very strong transparency. It could be, I think, because I'm sure that there is existing a link between the social development and the sustainable infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Karim. And now Carlos and then Remy. Carlos, please.
Thank you. We are all aware of the fact that the debate has evolved quite significantly, and there is now a much more larger consensus around the need to address the imperatives of climate and social equality. But at the same time, we are witnessing an exacerbation of some forms of asymmetry of power. So we have this paradox where, you know, there is a lot of goodwill. This goodwill often translates into forceful decisions by those who have the power to do so. And a lot of countries feel a bit vulnerable because they are not completely part of the decision. They are co-opted. And they have, most of the times, sympathy towards the same goals, but they have fears that are not properly addressed. And one demonstration of that has been the response to the pandemic. In sanitary terms, the least infected were the most affected. The least infected from a sanitary point of view, but most affected from an economic and social point of view. And I'm, of course, referring to Africa in particular. And I think the way to address this is to make sure that we have a discussion about just transition that is a bit more larger than we have had so far. For instance, I think there is a need to monetize the assets that African countries have in terms of fossil fuels. And the way we should monetize it, it's not necessarily to explore them or to enhance exploration of them, but rather in terms of giving them a value that has to be compensated by the global architecture for them not to go that route. So it's not just a matter of, you know, talking about mitigation, making sure that we have proposals that are going to leapfrog opportunities for African countries to industrialize and develop and grow their trade footprint. All of that is fine. But apart from that, we also need to monetize the cost of fossil fuels if we are not going to use them to propel Africa's development. And it's significant. And I think to ask countries that have just discovered their bounty or are completely dependent from their economic point of view of whatever fossil fuels they already export, to just do a just transition without giving something that is a bit more concrete in terms of compensation is not going to work. It's wishful thinking. So I think we need to address that upfront. And when doing so, we'll have less fears on the part of those who are already very much in favor of the transitions that we are discussing, but are not completely convinced it's not going to harm them.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And last word before I try to sum up very briefly is with Remy.
Thanks. To concretely answer the two questions raised by Lena, I really invite you to consider, invest, challenge, mobilize this Finance in Common movement we launched last year, and that will reconvene again next week in Rome, just before the G20 and Glasgow. We will produce new research with the University of Peking and others. So this community of all public development banks gathers 530 institutions. The total balance sheet is 19 trillion US dollar. It's about 2.5 trillion US dollar investments each year. And the balance of it is very interesting. You have 10% multilateral institutions, so it's significant. but the bulk of it, I mean, 90% of the financial capacity of the group lies in national 70% and subnational institutions 20%. There are 100 public development banks in Africa only, Carlos. So, and of course, if you consider these figures, you understand immediately that the voice of the global South is extremely strong in this group, especially the voice of middle-income countries that are so severely hit by the COVID-19 crisis right now. And so, envisioning, structuring, enlarging the discussion at that scale, I think, I'm convinced, could help ease the global discussion and the global governance. That's the first question. The second question is, of course, well, public development banks have always been positioned to address market failures. So when we're talking about food security, we're talking about history for these institutions. When we are talking about climate, when we are talking, yes, Sharon is right about social rights, human rights, safeguards. Of course, we can do more. We can have a stronger and more unified mandate on this, but there's an experience in these institutions on how to deal with indigenous people, how to deal with specific settings that can be strengthened and that can be shared. Mobilizing, of course, all the connections beyond their own financial capacities, the connections these institutions have built sometimes for decades, deep in their constituencies. So that's the proposal I make in the hope to contribute to the discussion and to the international meetings. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amy. It sounds like a very exciting meeting. I've been asked to sum up. I'll try to do it in 3 minutes. The first thing I think that we've shared is a very strong emphasis on the objectives as encapsulated, embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, a product of the UN system, and I think a very valuable statement of what we mean when we talk about sustainability. And we coupled that with a sense of urgency, and we emphasize that sustainability in the sense that we're describing here is not some inconvenient externality that's added on as a footnote at the end. It's at the heart of the development story. Secondly, we recognize that we had a lot of institutions with potential, but they had to move more quickly to a world which has already changed and a world which will continue to change in terms of not only its economic and social structure, multipolar, important, difficult issues of inequality, but also a world facing different challenges. So the institutions we have should be moving much more strongly towards taking into account the change in the world and the change in the challenges that the world faces. And we recognize that a lot of that movement would be increased leadership from what is loosely termed the South. The third thing was around, within these objectives and institutional structures, an emphasis on behavior founded in an understanding of rights and understanding of injustices, recognizing that behavior and politics are interwoven, that leadership and social action matter greatly. We rightly stress the example of the vaccines as a case of failure, when actually we could recognize what collaborative behavior meant very quickly, and the resources involved in the grand order of things were really not very large. So let's learn from failure as well as from some successes like COP21 in Paris. But within the institutions, how we behave, how we carry ourselves, the spirit of internationalism is enormously important. Fourth, in this context, of extra investment to achieve the SDGs, to deliver us this new growth story, much better than the old one. Cities where you can move and breathe, ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, much more efficient use of resources. We have in our hands a different story of development and growth, much more attractive, much more inclusive. But we have to invest to get it. We have to manage change to get it. And finance will be absolutely at center stage in that story. The last one is the hope. And I have a privilege, and some of you on this call do, of working at a university. We live with the young people, and this generation is absolutely outstanding. I don't think that's been true of all of them. There were some flat periods where the young were not so directly active on the big issues of the day, but the young are on the right side of history. And in particular, it's not simply they're shouting us to do something. They should actually shout at us to do something, but they're deeply involved in what it is to be done. They understand the issues, they're into the detail, they're telling us how we can do things. They've been thinking about this for a big fraction of their life already. So it's the young that give us hope. So let me finish there. Congratulations, happy birthday, and lots more decades for IDRI leading the charge on sustainable development. And thank you, Lena, Kareem, all involved in this, for bringing us